Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BuzzStream podcast. I'm your host, Vince Nero. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Chris Lewis, the head of digital PR at FinanceBuzz. How you doing, Chris?
Real good. Happy to be here.
Before we get into this, just want to remind everybody to like and subscribe. The more that we can share this stuff around to people, the more I can have great guests like Chris on. So FinanceBuzz is part of LaunchPotato. I think I connected with you via LinkedIn. I was trying to find some in-house companies that have had a lot of success with digital PR and kind of really try to break down the reasons and the strategies used. I found LaunchPotato is a little different than typical in-house. So why don't we start there and just like explain a little bit about what LaunchPotato is, how FinanceBuzz fits into that, so we can kind of set the scene before we kind of get into some of the cool strategies that you guys have been utilizing.
Sure. So LaunchPotato is a company that really just connects advertisers to people. We do that in a bunch of different ways through a bunch of different domains. So I like to think of it as kind of, a holding property, something like that, where we control a bunch of domains and a bunch of properties online. In each of them, we're just trying to connect advertisers to customers however we can. So some of the ways we do that, FinanceBuzz is probably our biggest, right? FinanceBuzz.com is a site, just helps people with their money, connects people to budgeting apps, whether it's a credit card product, different financial products, different kinds of financial needs, whatever people need. FinanceBuzz is a place where we try to do that for people.
Yeah. Kind of sounds like, yeah, sure, people have seen these types of sites out there, then the nerd wallets and, the rest,
So,
the bank rate, So what was interesting again to me though, is it kind of sounds like, you're using agency tactics or kind of like agency mindset for these sites, but they're kind of owned and operated by you guys. Is that kind of the right way to look at it?
exactly. So, we have a couple of properties that we do digital PR for, right, as part of larger SEO initiatives for these sites. So we have, a digital security site that we do a bunch of work on, FinanceBuzz, and a couple others. But, you hit the nail on the head. Kind of bringing that agency model in-house, with a smaller team, but working across a couple select sites rather than a huge book of clients.
Yeah. So we got to talking a little bit, and I came across this amazing post that you guys did that was super successful. Built something like 2,000 links, referring domains to a single campaign. So that's what I really want to talk to you about. This is the fast food prices versus inflation. That's the post. I'll be sure to link to it in the show notes. So let's get into it.
Cool.
Can you explain the post a little bit?
So this was a campaign that we were coming up with in Q2 of last year. And it was, around where a lot of conversations were having about inflation. And so we were like, right, we're a personal finance site. A lot of our digital PR content has to do with personal finance and money. And it really like spreads the gamut between super, super niche, surveys about banking preferences and checking account preferences and that kind of stuff to the really, really tangential, right? Especially around, the holidays as we start getting into it more. And so this was an idea about fast food prices that was kind of born from like our everyday experience, right? Like I think a lot of the conversations around inflation at the time were happening around like gas prices was a huge one for a while. And then it started seeking like grocery prices. And internally we were talking, even like anecdotally in my own like family conversations. My brother was like, "Have you seen the price of a Whopper Jr. lately?" And so it was definitely in the zeitgeist, and when we were coming up with this idea, somebody on my team, I'll give him credit, his name's Josh, he's incredible, was like, we need to figure out how much fast food has gone up because he's like, because I just went to the drive-thru and it's crazy. And so like, a lot of, I think probably my favorite digital PR ideas, it's just kind of born out of our own feelings and experience. And so I kind of trepidatiously was like, yeah, I guess we can explore it. And the more and more we bought into it, I think the more rich the data was, the more compelling the story was, and it ended up becoming something like so much bigger than just a digital PR campaign for us.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a couple things I wanted to talk about there. Let's actually get back to them because I don't want to lose this thread. So the data gathering, once you come up with the idea, gathering the data, let's get into how you actually found it, because it sounds like it was part of kind of the evaluation of if this idea would actually take off, right?
Exactly. So initially, I think the idea was let's figure out how much fast food prices generally have gone up. right? And we started saying, okay, well, how can we figure that out? We need to find pricing today versus historical, right? And if we're able to do that, we'll find out whatever that number is, right? And really, we were thinking about the general fast food market, but we kind of realized like the only way to really do it is to go kind of like line item by line item on menus and do it that way, right? Because there's not going to be one single source that's saying like, in general, fast food prices have gone up X amount. So as we started collecting that, we started seeing trends within the market generally, which is kind of what we were after, but also individual retailers, right? Some are, chain, we call them fast food chains. One thing that we found was a lot of these sites are a little bit cagey with their pricing, and a lot of it is dynamic. So a McDonald's, I live in Miami, McDonald's in Miami are more expensive than McDonald's in Middle America, or in New York City, they happen to be the most expensive McDonald's. So we realized we couldn't totally trust the, pricing, that was just our actually or wherever. So we started looking for other ways to find the data. Like most of our data collection, like it just starts with a Google. Really just Googled, where can I find fast food menu prices? And the first thing we found that was interesting was a lot of receipts, a lot of pictures of receipts. And the things that we noticed about the pictures of the receipts is that they were dated, right? So we'll see, a receipt with a Big Mac purchase on it from all these dates. And so we just started writing them down and eventually stumbled across a couple sites that have kind of like current national pricing, or at least pricing in some locations. And so we were thinking, all right, well, from there, how do we get that historically, right? Because they're just posting them, their current prices. And we remember the Wayback Machine, the old handy Internet Archive.
Mhm.
Okay, well, I wonder how often this was archived. And luckily, these sites have been operating for long enough that we were able to go back. What I wanted to do was go back a decade and see what the numbers were. So we went back, exactly 10 years to the date, and then exactly 5 years to the date, and then current date. And really just manually, from, I don't know, 12 or so fast food chains, looked at, I think, like 10 to 12 items on each menu, and just gathered those 3 data points for each. So it was super, super manual. But ultimately, doesn't 100 isn't that big of a number when you really get.
Yeah, that's great. I felt like a rush of adrenaline when you're telling me like the Wayback Machine, like I've definitely been there where you're like, I can't find this data. And then you're like, oh, I found it. This is the way we're going to do it. And I think one thing that really sticks out to me is like, most of the people I talk to, and, I've done this myself, it's the most successful campaigns seem to be the ones that you have to do some of that manual digging, right? It's not just like, hey, here's a site that has all the stuff. I mean, you kind of backed into that a bit, but like you still had to do the Wayback Machine and do some manual digging. Because to me, like that is the stuff that ChatGPT, AI overviews, like they're not going to be able to just pull out, right? And that's the stuff that's interesting to journalists, to readers, and bloggers. And I think that gets missed a lot with campaigns for people.
Absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head with like, that's what ends up being most exciting because it's also the data it has them in mind. Digital PRs that have been in the space and been doing it for long enough that like, we all know the data sets. We all use the same data sets. So, the transportation statistics, like we've all done the airplane campaigns, right? Some variations of it. So finding unique data sets and really like creating your own unique data sets is what builds that like kind of uniqueness. And also a lot of like the emotion that like I think the market is asking for.
Yeah, totally. All right. So let's keep on the kind of production theme of this. So once you get the data, what does that look like next? Does it get passed off to writers who are going to analyze and write it? Do you have that in house?
So everything we do at FinanceBuzz is done in house with, some like kind of rare exceptions, especially on the creative side. Our team likes to have the people who are collecting the data, actually do the analysis and do the writing themselves.
Love that. Yeah.
It's a tricky tightrope to walk because a lot of times, the data people aren't great writers or, great writers aren't super into the thing. And we definitely hire it with that in mind. Like we want people who are able to write about it. But we also know that the person who ends up writing about this has to be super connected to the data because they have to understand, right? I have a data science background and like my whole thing is scrutiny and thinking really, really hard about if I was a journalist and I really didn't want to cover this, like, if my editor handed this to me on my plate and I wanted to make an excuse for why I didn't have to cover it, like That's what I want to solve for early on in the process so that we don't run into it later. So we do it all in-house. And so for this particular campaign, it was also the same person who came up with the idea, right? This was
Yeah.
somebody who loves fast food, was really passionate about the idea. I said, great, run with it. And then not only is he collecting the data and understands it all, backwards and forward, but that enthusiasm, I think, translates into the writing and translates into the finished product.
Yeah, 100%. And that's how we used to do it. When I was at Siege Media, it was the person that ideated and wrote it, researched it, worked with the designer, and then also did the outreach too, the pitching and stuff. And I think that also helps eliminate, like I've talked to a couple people on the pod who talk about this idea of like, protecting your idea from the inception, right? Like when you go to do data analysis or maybe somebody else is doing it, data gathering, like maybe you don't find a specific stat that you need. So you kind of tweak the idea a little bit.
Yep.
But having that person that is kind of championing the idea all the way through, I think that helps kind of keep, like, what made this idea unique from the start. What's going to catch people. So like you can kind of keep that path all the way through. I think that's super important.
Totally.
Yeah. So, okay, now let's get into the outreach, right? So talk to me about your team, the outreach team. Is it different than the person that's doing the research?
Yeah. So we typically we'll have somebody else outreach. But I don't want it to sound like they're totally disparate. I mean, yes, they're two separate people. But our outreach, our media relations team, right, is very, very involved in the process. And in fact, they kind of own it a little bit. So our data folks are really good at collecting a lot of data, but our outreach team is really, really critical in saying like, okay, here's the outline for what we're actually going to end up writing about, with a lot of conversations. And they're at the kickoff meetings when we're, talking about how we collect stuff. They're there when we review the data, right? There's always a data review meeting where we go over everything and we talk about here's what's interesting, here's what's not. And we start to kind of puzzle piece it in a way where we're going to be able to tell a compelling story. And it's really important for us to have those media relations people there from day one, right? Because they're the ones who have to sell it. So not only do they need to understand it, front and back, just like our data team does and just like the writers do. But if they're going to sell it, I want them to have the same kind of buy-in as everybody else. So they're the ones who end up pitching it. But it's not like they're just handed a campaign, right? They've been with this for over a month at that point. So they're super familiar with it.
Yeah. I mean, either way you do it, it's like having that person that's going to be pitching it involved at the early stage, whether or not it's the same person or a different team. I think that's probably the key, is like understanding this is what makes this valuable. This is how, this is what the story is going to be and why it's going to be enticing for journalists.
Yep.
Like if you have that in mind from the start, that seems to be the most important part, however you decide to do it. Okay. So once the media relations team picks it up, talk to me about kind of crafting the emails, crafting the angles, the volume that you send, that kind of stuff. I think is interesting for people to hear, to understand, you got 2,000 links, but did you send out 5,000 emails or something,
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I think this is a good illustration of kind of this like iterative experience, right? So it starts off with kind of one intention, just like the campaign did, frankly, and then kind of morphs into something else. So for this campaign, right, we get the data back, we come up with our hook, and we start pitching it out. Subject line wise, we were going with something like, fast food's risen, at the rate of inflation in the last decade. And typically we'll test 2 or 3 subject lines. At the same time, we'll pitch it out to, 20 people, say for subject line A, B, and C, see what the open rates look like, see what the click rates look like. And they kind of make decisions from there. With this one, remember that all of them were very good. And we actually started seeing coverage pretty quickly. What was interesting about this outreach was immediately what everybody took to wasn't necessarily like the overall, fast food market's doing X, Y, and Z. It was McDonald's. It was. Our study showed that McDonald's had doubled their prices in the last 10 years, which was the highest of any of these, and when you're thinking about something like fast food, right? Fast food is like the pinnacle of like economical eating, right? For millions and millions of Americans. So when you see the doubled number, and 100% increase, you got, okay, well, something's up here. And like all of a sudden it becomes very, very emotional. So we pitched it kind of one way, and then we started seeing the headlines come in. I think the first major headline we saw was from, Scripps News or maybe Business Insider or somebody. And it was just McDonald's has doubled prices. And then the news started looking at it was McDonald's has doubled prices. And we were kind of like, oh, we gotta change course here. So our subject lines from then on were just about McDonald's. And rather than in the pitch, us talking about, tons and tons of different things, yes, we still included a bunch of the summary data and things like that, but we started making it more focused based on what the media was responding to.
Yeah, I love that approach. So what would you say, like, so you A/B test the first kind of route of it, then are you A/B testing the new like McDonald's, angle?
Exactly. So we switched subject lines, we switched the pitch a little bit. We start A/B testing those angles. And then I think one of the British publications, the headline said McDoubled in their line. We were like, that's the new subject line. Like we don't even.
Yeah, yeah. Nice, nice.
You can always cut
So
for Columber had the.
right, right. Tell me about like the timeline of this, right? So you start sending it out, but it sounds like got coverage kind of pretty quickly, right? But then you pivoted. How long are you sending out outreach for this campaign?
I'd say the first, we probably was about a week until we saw our first piece of coverage, or maybe a little bit less. We started seriously seeing, the pickup on McDonald's angle probably a week later. And then we continued outreach for probably the next like 3 or 4 weeks. Our timelines are pretty long for outreach, I'd say. Which ended up in this case being a huge, huge benefit because as we were producing these articles and we were seeing them, it was a really solid campaign. It was getting great results. But kind of at the same time, there was also a big social media swell. Not just on our articles. We did see a lot of like Reddit pickups and our inflation and things like that picking up. But we started seeing a bunch of virality of people's McDonald's receipts because there was a bunch of outcry over a $25 Big Mac meal. So we started seeing this on TikTok and it was getting, millions of views. And we were like, okay, well, how can we lean into this more? And so as things started swishing, with the media landscape, right, they were talking about this $35 Big Mac meal. Is it a real thing? Where is it a real thing? We started not only incorporating that into our pitches, but like continuing to feed that fire however we could. So we kept outreach for a relatively long time. And then the other thing that happened was California had a $25 minimum wage increase that started to take effect, probably in, over a month of us pitching this thing. And so as that was happening, we were thinking, okay, well, what's that going to do to fast food prices, right? Because when you think about minimum wage in, the biggest state in our country, right, you'd start thinking like minimum wage workers, like there is no more typical than a fast food worker. So we were saying, okay, well, what would that do to prices? So we had a kind of a total strategy shift, a month in or whatever that was, and started, rather than just targeting the CNNs, like we made a huge, huge California regional list. And started, going, anybody who's covering California, anything, or really anybody who's covering this minimum wage hike, which ended up doing us, great numbers regionally as well.
So that kind of angle and new stat kind of that you come up with or new story that you're kind of leveraging, that kind of becomes the new intro to the email.
Yeah.
That's
Exactly.
the hook.
So whether it's $25 Big Mac, like that was definitely in our, phase 2 pitches. And then it was California, recently had this $25 minimum wage increase. What's that going to do to prices? Well, he was talking about it is without that.
Right.
Our pitches should change really, really drastically within that, 6 weeks period of pitching.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fascinating kind of, or I should say it's kind of like a microcosm of how I think content strategies and like PR strategies should work, right? I feel like though the tough part for maybe people working in an agency and maybe where you kind of benefit working in-house is a lot of times with agency, it's like, okay, we've gotten this post, we've gotten, coverage on this. Now it's time to jump onto the next thing, right? Whereas when you're in-house, you can kind of see this and maybe I know this isn't every single agency that does this, but I know there's always kind of that, you've promised a certain amount of assets to be created or, so it can sometimes be tough to do that. But it sounds like as in your case, I mean, in-house, you have that flexibility, but for people in an agency, it's maybe just a matter of explaining, that there is more juice to squeeze from, from this post that you're working on.
Yeah, it's definitely that kind of fluidity is definitely a huge advantage of doing things in house. You know, agencies, I think the great agencies and the ones that have really healthy partnerships can start identifying those, maybe as quick as in-house teams can, and saying, "Hey, I know our contract says this, and we have to produce X amount of campaigns, but instead of the next one, like we're just going to keep going on this, and if it doesn't pan out, it doesn't pan out, and we'll figure it out later." But I think a lot of good agencies also have that intuition and can do it, but a lot of them aren't super incentivized to under their contracts or whatever. So, you know, yeah, I would hope that good agencies can see the opportunity and kind of counsel on it. But when it's in house, it's so much easier to do, and it's not a tough conversation with the client, and it's just kind of like, well, what else are we going to do? Why not?
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. All right. Before we get too far away from the email thing, one thing I like to talk to people about is kind of the personalization of emails. There seems to be kind of like a difference in opinion of, how personalized you want to take each email, especially to a journalist. Are you personalizing the subject line, tailoring it to kind of like how they write their headlines? Do you add that little hook in the beginning where it's like, hey, Chris, I saw you wrote about inflation, really love the article. Here's another similar piece. Are you doing any of that type of personalization? Do you think it's important?
I do think it's important, and it is something we do, but I wouldn't say it's like a one size fits all approach. So what we typically do in the list building process is, as we're building, our list of our journalists we're going to target, we'll start flagging them kind of as VIPs, right? So these are going to be typically people who hire VR pubs, right? People who, people who, I can kind of tell take digital PR pitches from people who have covered surveys from other people. Like you can definitely tell the writers that do versus the writers that don't. Right. And so, if all of this is kind of a game of batting averages, the ones where you're going to have a higher batting average with. Right. So we'll start marketing those and saying like, this is a good time for personalization. A lot of times based on what they write or if they've written about something, I use like would you be upset if they didn't cover this kind of a test? And then those people get flagged for personalized pitches. So it ends up being a much smaller subsection of the total people we pitch that will get like very personalized subject lines and really more personalized pitches themselves. A lot of the template is still probably in those, but maybe a personal connection, something like that, or potentially some quote offers or additional information if we know that they're going to like them, or with somebody we have a relationship with. And it also kind of depends, like, for our California regional, right? That was a numbers game for us, right? We're not going to have the time to personalize to everybody. But when when we're targeting local radio stations and news outlets in California, or whatever. But for the most part, like, I always like to balance it. Let's put the effort and energy where we think it's going to pay off or has a higher likelihood of paying off. And then others can get, a seemingly personalized email, or just a template.
Yeah, I think there's definitely stages of personalization or tiers of personalization. Um, Whether or not you're just getting their name right, I feel like is one.
You can start.
Yeah. So you mentioned the quote saying, offering quotes to more of those like VIPs. Is that something that you don't do universally? Because I know there's, again, like this is a strategy that some people stand by. They put in on every single pitch they do is like, here's a quote from the CEO of FinanceBuzz on why inflation is, hitting that, just to give the journalists one extra thing that they maybe don't have to come back to you for before they read their article.
Yeah, we've tested it. Candidly, I don't use it a lot. Most of the time, or the vast majority of the time, I'd say. Usually, what we'll do, on our template emails is saying, "We're happy to offer quotes. We have these experts available." But if it's somebody who we know is going to want to quote right away, or if they have a specific angle, so some journalists that we'll work with always say like, "Okay, can I have a consumer focused quote?" So when it's one of when it's one of those, like it's going to be a different quote than something we would give somebody else. So we usually include it up front.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So I had written down a couple questions based off of like some of the early stuff you said. I feel like we kind of hit this one, from start to finish process wise. But I want to come back to kind of something you said very early about ideation. And I think back to some of the most compelling campaigns that I was a part of, and most of them started with, like you said, like you're talking at the dinner table with someone, you're talking to your relatives, brother, sister, whatever, and it's this seed of an idea that has some emotional tie, right? Like there's a discussion around it. So I guess the question there is like, are you always kind of like, is your digital PR mind kind of always going, and that's kind of where you're just able to extract these? Like if you were to process size this, put a process to ideation and finding those ideas that work in outside of just your job, right? Like where do you do it? Where do you find these ideas?
It's funny you mentioned like just in your everyday, do you happen to come across them? Like the answer to that is yes. And I think that's the case for a lot of digital PR is like you'll stumble upon an idea as you're doing something in your life. We do formal ideation sessions with our team, kind of the smaller digital PR team, but we also do ideation sessions quarterly with a larger team, right? Because we also kind of realize that our experience isn't everybody's experience. And so we do it with our larger SEO team, our larger editorial team. Um, and it's interesting because they will bring in ideas that we would have never thought of based on what they're working on. So for instance, like at FinanceBuzz, we do a lot of syndicated content. A lot of these are like, the Costco tricks and Trader Joe's items that you should buy this quarter and things like that. They're go to syndication partners that wouldn't be great candidates for, traditional digital PR content, but they have this insight that's really valuable to us, which is, some of that data, especially like, hey, when we talk about these brands, it tends to do really well. What can we do about brands? So we loop in kind of everybody with who has, varying degrees of understanding of digital PR and what we do. I always say that like the best digital PR idea, like kind of mixes methodology, that like methodologically sound, something concrete, and then some part of your own personal life, right? With finance and personal finance, I think it happens to be pretty easy or much easier than some other verticals, right? Because money touches us in all these different ways, right? It's, from your job and employment, like that's a huge sector, to your everyday consumer spending, to whatever trend. So it ends up being somewhat easy to come up with ideas that relate to our personal life, but that's the way I always like to start them at least.
Yeah. So once you come up with those ideas, so you talked through this a bit, and I want to dig in a little bit more about the validation process. You had said earlier, there's a lot of digging into the data, and that seems like that's a big piece of it. But I remember kind of sometimes you struggle with people's ideas that don't necessarily, like you said, have the digital PR background, right? Like they might throw out something that's interesting, but you're like, I don't know if that's going to work, but you still want to check into it, right? Like, so what does that process look like to evaluate these ideas?
So typically when we get a good idea, and one thing that the team is really good about is I always say like, I want your idea in the form of a headline.
Mhm.
And so rather than just a list of ideas, right, I'm getting a list of headlines that we're evaluating. And then I can kind of go, yeah, that would work. Or that could be a journalist headline. And that I think is a lot easier it's a little bit more palatable and a little bit easier to decipher what could be successful. Um, but figuring it out is the tough part. Like figuring it out, like, yes, you kind of make a snap judgment on like, yeah, I think it could be successful. And then you have to do the due diligence of digging into the ideas. And that process can kind of take a long time. One thing that I do think is a big like advantage of in-house work is that you have no problem killing ideas after we've started. So, in an agency setting, you might have to think of a bunch of ideas really, really hard, validate and invent them before you pitch them to a client, because you don't want to be in a scenario where you pitch an idea, you've agreed to go forward with it, and then you have to kill it 2 weeks later because you can't update it or for whatever reason. Like, it's definitely not unheard of. And I think the great agencies are really transparent about that being part of the process. But in-house, like we'll kill a lot of ideas very quickly and have really no problem with it. Because we have that like ability to, there's no tough conversation. There's no struggling with it. There's no, oh, we've promised something to anybody, which that kind of fluidity is really helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I'm definitely thinking about this from the agency side of things. Like you come up with this idea, I want to make sure that it's got legs before I pitch it to the client. So I love that process. You know, you kind of, again, like thinking from the pitch side of things too, right? Like, how would I pitch this? So just so I'm clear, it's like pitch a headline. Maybe it's, fall is everyone's favorite time of year, whatever, something silly. So then the validation process is, okay, I'm going to find other people that have talked about this. Like, what like, does it, I know you mentioned this kind of three checks, right? Like, it has a data, does it have a concreteness? And then is it kind of like emotional? But yeah, like, what does that look like from, audience standpoint? Are you looking at your media database and seeing like, are there enough people in this audience? Yeah. Talk me through that.
So the first thing what we do is we'll Google the idea and look for surveys or for other data studies that are on either the same idea or tangentially similar ones. That ends up, and that's definitely part of our kickoff process. It ends up reading a lot of, good ideas for us in what to either lean into or stay away from. And the other thing it does is like kind of immediately give us like competitor content to work through. And, we can look up their HRS report and see like, where was it successful? How successful was it? So we have some kind of like proxy metrics, I'd say, putting into it. We also have kind of our whole team reviewing ideation. So our data guy's on it, right? And he's saying, no way can we get this data. Because the one who'll know the best. Our promo team is on and is like, I am not going to be able to pitch that. So we get a bunch of voices in the room and like get a lot of consensus on these ideas before we really, really like lean into them.
Yeah. So it sounds like you, like, thinking from, the pitch process, it's like you do kind of have to have, like, outside of those proxies, right? Like the competitor content that's already done this, you do have to have some intuition and maybe some experience, right? Like, behind, okay, I can actually pitch this. What if you don't? Like, what would you go to? Do you have new people on your outreach team, that are fresh out of college, just like, I haven't done this? Like, what does that look like for them?
They're definitely funny conversations now because sometimes it's hard to have a conversation sometimes with people that things just aren't interesting. When when somebody brings you a pitch and it's like, here are the most interesting things I found. And you're like, I didn't think any of that's interesting. It's a hard conversation to have because it's hard to have constructively. It's like having the conversation like it's just about writing. There's not a lot to do with that.
Or it might just be like, oh, well, that's your opinion.
Yeah,
Right.
totally. And candidly, like my opinion's wrong a lot. This fast food campaign that we're talking about, like I kind of initially was like, meh, right? And I kind of let my team run with it. And they ended up doing an awesome job and being very happy to be wrong about it. I think to your point, like anybody can make the case. And I think we want to give people that opportunity to be right and to be wrong. Right. One huge advantage of being in-house is that like we can miss a lot. And it's not really a huge sweat for us. So good ideas, bad ideas, a lot of them can get produced or initially pitched or whatever, and have people who fight for them, who believe in them, and then learn from them. So for junior members of the team, right, just ask questions like, why do you think it would be successful? Can you find other articles that they might make you believe that? And a lot of times they're able to back it up, or there might be something kind of like, they just don't have the institutional knowledge or whatever, and you're able to educate them in that way. So it actually, that ideation process and the vetting process is a huge training part for us. Just look at these old campaigns. What makes them successful? What do you think makes them successful? It ends up being a really good tool for us, especially for the more junior people who just aren't sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I can definitely see, I mean, I've been in the same spot with a lot of those. Yeah. The ideation process is, I think, where you probably learn the most, right? And maybe have the hardest time sometimes when you're first starting, and it can be the most frustrating because you think these ideas are great, and you might have a gut reaction to it and you're trying to push it through, but it's just not. I think that was probably the biggest learning for me, was like, don't get too attached to any ideas, and because there's always other stuff you can pivot to, right? There's always other stuff out there.
And especially for the team, I think they'll finally come up with a great idea, and then you Google it, and it's just been done, and it's been done well. It's been done well in the last 3 months, right? And then that's kind of the end of the conversation.
Yeah. All right. Last thing I want to talk about is repurposing this content. So you had your campaign, did really well. throughout the life cycle, you kind of pivoted into different news items that were happening and were able to change the angle a bit. Eventually, though, you decided to stop, right? Like, let's talk about that. What made you, okay, now it's time to move on to the next campaign?
So there were a couple of impetuses. First, you start seeing link volume just kind of with a campaign like this, you'll start seeing natural links come in. In this case, it was a much larger conversation that was happening. What ended up happening specifically here was McDonald's CEO put out a press release that was basically about our campaign. And it was, this kind of waxy piece about I first entered my McDonald's when I'm young. It's such a piece of my fabric, but I want everybody to, I've been hearing all this stuff on social media, but I also want to be realistic about, McDonald's pricing and why we're committed to providing valuable meals for families and things like that. And it spun into our data. And this is what really hockey sticked, I think, the results. Because now all of a sudden it was like in this kind of corporate businessy, shareholdery, really it was a letter of shareholders, right? And so when journalists were covering this, they were looking for data, and ours was the one that was out there. It was also the one that was cited in the report. So at this point, we leaned into this for about a week, right? We ended up writing a press release kind of in response to it and saying, hey, here's why we sent behind our data and things like that, which was a fun experience in Excel. But after that, McDonald's started responding in different ways. One way was they created these value meals, like a $5 meal. And a bunch of the other fast food chains started doing the same thing. So the conversation was kind of shifting away from fast food prices are high to, hey, look at these value meals, which I think was a really smart tactic on their part too. And that started kind of becoming the end as we were pitching this. One thing that was happening was the snowball was definitely rolling. And we realized that the equity we would put into pitching probably wasn't going to yield as high results, just the natural pickups we were going to get. So we were kind of just like, let's let it do its thing and we can move on to the next thing and reallocate our resources.
Yeah. And eventually you did kind of, I don't want to call it repurposing because that's not necessarily what you did, but you kind of have a follow-up piece that you did to this, right?
Right. So after all the fast food companies started making their value meals, we said, okay, why don't we just compare all of these compared to their actual pricing? This is the best value meal. This is the one that actually doesn't save you all that much money to begin with, right? So we're able to take that idea, put it in a new piece of content, and then pitch it as a fresh piece of content. It's great because not only is it continuing to send signal that we're experts in this area, but it's also just part of this larger inflation area. And we already kind of have our name in it a little bit. So we're able to reference the previous beats in our pitches and things like that.
Right. In 10 years from now, you can do a value meal inflation study.
Totally. There actually has, to your point about repurposing, it's not just that idea, right, that got repurposed. So we're also able in-house to take an idea like that and start repurposing it in some of our other channels, right? So I mentioned we do syndication content, right? This is great fire for syndication partners, right? So what if they just, wrote an article on McDonald's and then one on Taco Bell and then one on KFC? All of a sudden that spun into 10 different ideas, right? What if we just looked at chicken sandwiches? These are the fast food chains that have risen their chicken sandwich prices the most. So we're able to spin it off with 20 or 30 more ideas just based on this one data set. We're not going to pitch them, but they might do well in syndication or in other channels, which is a cool experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Chris, I feel like that's a good stopping point. I want to leave with one last thing is just with all the success of this one campaign, right? It's easy to think about okay, if I get into this, this is something easy to replicate, but realistically, not every piece you're going to do is going to get 2,000 links, right? So, so talk to me, maybe leave a little imparting message to people about how it's okay to fail. I mean, you mentioned this a lot, and that's kind of a little note I wrote here. It's you do have the advantage of being in-house, but that is how we learn, right? You learn from your successes like this. We also learn from your failures. So I'd love to just kind of hear your take on that.
Yeah. So realistically, I fail at something every single day. And it is whether it's personal or professional, but it is the impetus of growth. And I think that at LaunchPotato and Finance was like, we have that mindset of like, let's just fail as much as we can and learn as much as we can. Digital PR is especially cruel. Digital PR, I think takes, when we're hiring, like the thing I'm most worried about is somebody on the media relations team going to be able to take weeks or months long drought of pitches being successful? Like it just happens. And the reality of all of this is like, it's a numbers game. You have your batting average, I always think about it as a baseball analogy. Like the best baseball players, maybe are successful 3 in 10 times. Digital PR is very similar. Like 80% of our campaigns don't pan out that well, and that's fine. We just understand with some kind of certainty that the more and more tries we get at it, the more it's going to succeed in the long term. I think from an in-house perspective, like having leadership and, from the CEO on down who understands and embraces that is crucial to be able to tolerate any of this. Cause like it can be super brutal when things aren't going well. Like you start getting worried and things get scary. And I think good agencies, applying this to the agency side too, like the best agency client partnerships understand that too. A client will understand like, this is not going to go super smoothly. Like there of 10 campaigns, 2 of them might do super well. 2 of them might do kind of well and it's still a successful engagement. Like I wouldn't gauge, quite frankly, like I gauge campaigns like this as a little more fluky. We know some flukes will happen sometimes and they're great when they do, but like the successes that I really get excited about are like grinding out 15 links for a campaign that I didn't think would do well. That to me is really exciting. And that's where I think a lot of the growth happens. So yes, fail often and fail spectacularly and fall on your face and learn and make sure that you just have a supportive environment. And especially if you're building teams, to build a supportive environment where people are free to do that.
Yeah, love it. Well, Chris, it's been awesome chatting with you. You can catch Chris. He's very active on LinkedIn. Are you on Twitter as well, X?
Yep.
What's your handle so people can connect with you?
Lou Miami. Lou is like Lewis.
All right, Lou Miami. I'll put all this stuff in the show notes. Thanks again so much for being here, and thanks for watching. Again, reminder, like and subscribe. And if you have any questions about any of this stuff, please reach out in the comments. I'm sure Chris would be happy to answer anything. I am always available, as you know, on LinkedIn, comments, X, wherever you want to find me. Thanks again.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.